It happened in the kitchen on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was standing on my tiptoes, reaching for the top shelf of the cabinet, rearranging dishes that hadn't been touched in years. The faint hum of the radio filled the space, one of those easy listening stations I'd always kept on for company. It was supposed to be a simple task, one of the dozens I used to fill the quiet spaces in my day. Then Evan walked in. I didn't hear him at first. His steps were quiet, deliberate, the way they always were. I only noticed him when I turned to grab the next stack of plates and saw him leaning casually against the counter, his arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm, teasing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly, my cheeks flushing as I realized how flustered I sounded. He stepped closer, reaching past me for the glass on the shelf above my head. The movement was smooth, natural, but it brought him so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the earthy warmth of the rain outside. "Here," he said, handing me the glass, his voice quieter now. "Thanks," I murmured, but my voice faltered, my breath catching as his hand brushed against mine. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us shifted, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His eyes met mine, and the look in them made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a glance, it was searching, deliberate, like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned quickly to set the glass on the counter. My heart was pounding, and I hated how obvious it felt. "You've been busy," he said, his tone easy as he leaned against the counter. "It keeps me out of trouble," I replied, forcing a smile. "Trouble?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as the troublemaking type." I laughed, the sound more nervous than I intended. "Not anymore, at least." He didn't say anything, just watched me with that same faint smirk, his gaze steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. Evan had only been living with me for a month, but his presence in the house had already turned my carefully curated world upside down. When my husband, Richard, passed away 6 years ago, I'd spent the first few years drowning in the quiet. The house had been too big, too empty, and I'd filled it with routines and distractions, gardening, cooking, cleaning, anything to keep myself from thinking too much. It worked for a while, but then Evan came back. He'd called one evening out of the blue, his voice hesitant as he explained his situation. His tech job in Seattle had fallen through, his lease was up, and he needed a place to land for a while until he figured out his next steps. I could still remember the way he'd paused after asking, as though he were afraid I might say no. The next morning, the storm was gone, leaving the world outside fresh and quiet. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the rain-soaked garden, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing my coffee cup, the weight of the night before settled heavily on me. My reflection in the window was as familiar as always. But there was something different about the woman staring back at me. Something softer, something unsure. I had crossed a line, and though I didn't regret it, I couldn't ignore the questions clawing at the edges of my mind. "What happens now?" I didn't hear him come into the room, but I felt his presence before I turned around. Evan was standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked younger in the morning light, less guarded, and for a moment I let myself just take him in. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, setting the cup down and wiping my hands on a dish towel. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were testing the waters. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I nodded, though the truth was I wasn't sure how much of the night I'd actually spent sleeping. "Did you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He moved to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against it, his gaze fixed on me. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but it carried so much weight, and I felt my chest tighten under the pressure of it. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded as though he'd expected that answer. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to figure everything out right now." His words were a relief, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. "Last night, I began, but the words caught in my throat. Was real, he finished for me, his voice firm but kind. I looked up at him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. It's not that simple, Evan. I know, he said, stepping closer. But it doesn't mean it wasn't real. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, the warmth of his hand grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to know, he said gently. We'll figure it out. Together. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This is scary, I whispered. I know, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand, but you don't have to do it alone. We stood there in the quiet, the sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of the world outside distant and muffled. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. A fragile, tentative kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. I'm not asking for anything from you, he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. I just want you to know that I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be. His words stayed with me long after he left the room, echoing in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden. For years I'd told myself that I was fine on my own, that I didn't need anyone else. I'd built a life around that belief, one that was quiet and safe, but empty in ways I hadn't let myself acknowledge. But now, with Evan's words still lingering in the air, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. Was it possible to let myself feel again? To let myself be vulnerable? The thought scared me, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. When I finally stood, the house was quiet, the weight of the night before still settling over it like a blanket. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I was ready to face what came next. But as I looked out at the garden, the sunlight glinting off the rain-soaked leaves, I felt a small, tentative flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to let myself be happy. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to take a chance. Of course I hadn't. He was family. Well, technically. I had married Richard when Evan was already 16, a tall, gangly teenager with a quick wit and a quiet charm. We'd gotten along easily enough, though he'd always kept a respectful distance, never quite letting me in. After Richard's death, we drifted even further apart, our occasional phone calls polite but distant. Now, seeing him as an adult, I could barely reconcile the boy I remembered with the man standing in front of me. He was confident in a way that felt effortless. His sharp features softened by an easy smile that seemed to disarm everyone he met. But there was a depth to him, a quiet vulnerability that he rarely let slip, and it tugged at something in me I couldn't explain. You've been quiet today, Evan said, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the observation. Have I? He nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah. Something on your mind? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. How could I explain the jumble of emotions his presence had stirred in me? The way he seemed to unravel years of carefully constructed solitude with nothing more than a smile. Just thinking about how much needs to be done around here, I said finally, deflecting. Let me know if you need help, he said, his voice warm but casual. Thanks, I replied, turning back to the cabinet to avoid his gaze. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen. The warmth in his voice, the subtle weight of his presence. It wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. For years I'd told myself that I didn't need anyone else, that I was content with the life I'd built. But now, with Evan here, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but his face lingered in my mind, and for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever. The days that followed felt like walking through a maze, each turn more confusing than the last. Evan was everywhere. Not in an invasive way, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. I'd wake up to find him in the kitchen, sipping coffee at the table, his hair messy from sleep, and his bare feet tapping lightly against the floor. He always greeted me with the same easy smile, the kind that seemed to linger long after he'd left the room. Then there were the small things. The way he reached for plates while we set the table, his hand brushing against mine as if by accident. The quiet moments where he'd catch my eye and hold my gaze just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into every look, every word. But the truth was he had unsettled something in me. Something I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The weather had cooled slightly, the crispness of early autumn creeping into the air. I was tending to the roses, carefully trimming away the dead leaves, when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I turned to see him standing at the edge of the patio, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked casual, relaxed, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "I've got it," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. He didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer, crouching beside me and reaching for the pruning shears. "I'll do the heavy lifting," he said, his tone teasing. I sighed, handing them over. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "Must run in the family," he replied with a grin. We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the soft rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds filling the air. At one point I reached for a fallen rose, and our hands brushed against each other. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. But he had. "Sorry," he said softly, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It's fine," I replied, turning back to the roses. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Later that evening, we ended up in the kitchen again, cleaning up after dinner. It had become something of a routine, me washing the dishes, him drying them. It was a small gesture, but one I appreciated more than I let on. "You don't have to help, you know," I said as I handed him a plate. "I know," he replied, his tone light, "but I like being useful." I smiled despite myself, focusing on the warm water running over my hands. "You've always been that way." "Maybe," he said, leaning against the counter as he dried the plate, "but I think you bring it out in me." I glanced at him, startled by the comment. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady as he watched me. "Don't look so surprised," he said with a faint smile. "You're easy to be around." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I focused on the sink, scrubbing the same plate longer than necessary. "I mean it," he added, his voice softer now. "You make this place feel like home." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. For years, I'd convinced myself that I was fine on my own, that the life I'd built was enough. But in that moment, hearing those words from him, I realized how much I'd been craving connection, even if I hadn't let myself admit it. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. The next day, the tension between us seemed to grow. It wasn't overt, nothing had been said or done to cross any lines, but it was there, in the way he lingered in the doorway while I read on the couch, or the way his hand brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hall. "I didn't hear you come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The storm woke me up," he replied, stepping further into the room. His gaze shifted to the matches in my hand, and his lips curved into a faint smile. "You okay?" "Just startled," I said, straightening. "Let me," he said, reaching out to take the matches from me. Our hands brushed as he did, his fingers grazing mine in a way that felt unreasonably intimate. I froze, the air between us suddenly thick with something unspoken. He struck the match, the sudden flare of light illuminating his face, and for a moment I was struck by how easily he seemed to fill the room. He lit the candle and set it on the counter, the warm glow casting soft shadows on the walls. "There," he said, his voice quiet. "Thanks," I murmured, but my words felt hollow. My chest was tight, my thoughts tangled in a way I couldn't untangle. "Storms like this always make the house feel different," he said, leaning against the counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes were on me, steady and watchful. "Different how?" I asked, grateful for the distraction. "Quieter," he said after a moment. "Like it's holding its breath." I nodded, understanding what he meant more than I wanted to admit. He didn't move, didn't say anything else, and the silence stretched between us until it felt almost unbearable. "Do you want some tea?" I asked, the words tumbling out too quickly. "Sure," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. I busied myself with the kettle, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. But even as I moved around the kitchen, I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting. When the tea was ready, I handed him a mug, careful not to let our hands touch. He accepted it with a quiet, "Thanks," his fingers brushing against mine anyway. We sat at the table, the candle flickering between us, the storm raging outside. He leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around the mug, his expression thoughtful. "You're quiet tonight," he said finally. "Just tired," I replied, though the words felt hollow. "You've been saying that a lot lately," he said, his tone soft but probing. I didn't know how to respond, so I took a sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "I worry about you, you know," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. His words caught me off guard, and I looked up at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Why?" "Because you don't let anyone in," he said simply. "You keep everything bottled up like you're afraid to let anyone see the real you." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. "You don't have to do that with me," he said, his gaze locked on mine. "You don't have to pretend." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "It's not that simple," I said quietly. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because I'm scared," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but you don't have to be." His hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Evan," I began, but my voice faltered. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. I want you to know that I'm here. For you. No matter what." His words lingered in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "You just have to let yourself feel it." The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, the sound of the rain and thunder drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I let myself see the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet sincerity in his voice. It scared me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. "Can we just—" I trailed off, unsure of what I was even asking. "Take it one step at a time," he finished for me, his lips curving into a small, understanding smile. I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. When he finally stood, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment before he turned to leave, I felt the air rush back into my lungs. "Good night, Marianne," he said softly, his voice warm and steady. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he disappeared down the hall, I stayed where I was, staring at the candle's flickering flame. My heart was still pounding, and my thoughts were still tangled. But for the first time in years, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from this. The morning after the storm brought a strange kind of clarity. The air outside was crisp and clean, the sunlight breaking through the lingering gray clouds to illuminate the garden. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual, as though it too were holding its breath. I spent most of the morning in the kitchen, my hands busy kneading dough for a loaf of bread. The rhythm of the task was soothing, and I focused on it with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, desperate for something to drown out the whirlwind of thoughts in my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Evan had looked at me the night before. The quiet sincerity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the gentle brush of his hand against mine. He didn't make an appearance until nearly noon, and when he did, it was with the same easy confidence that seemed to come so naturally to him. He walked into the kitchen barefoot, his hair slightly messy, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but casual. "Morning," I replied, my tone brisk as I turned back to the counter. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he watched me. "You've been up early." "I had things to do," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Looks like you're doing everything," he said with a faint smile, nodding toward the counter where the dough sat. "You always do." His words struck a nerve, and I turned to face him, my hands still dusted with flour. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you take on too much," he said simply, his gaze steady. "You're always trying to do everything yourself." "Someone has to," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Why does it always have to be you? He asked, stepping into the room. I didn't have an answer for that, so I turned back to the dough, pressing my hands into it with more force than necessary. You don't have to do it all alone, he said softly, his voice closer now. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my chest tighten. I'm used to it, I said finally, my voice quieter now. That doesn't mean it's right, he replied. I froze, my hands stilling against the dough as his words sank in. He was close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, and when I turned to look at him, the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to keep shutting people out. The vulnerability in his voice broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. I can't let myself feel, he finished for me, his tone gentle but insistent. I nodded, my chest tight with the weight of everything I'd been holding back. You don't have to be afraid, he said, his hand reaching out to rest lightly on my arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my defenses begin to crumble. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us thick and unspoken. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said softly. Just let yourself feel it. That's all I'm asking. His words were a lifeline, pulling me toward something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Evan, I began, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer, his hand sliding down to clasp mine. It's okay, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. We can take it slow. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the oven timer going off, the sharp beep cutting through the quiet. I stepped back quickly, breaking the connection, and turned to pull the tray of bread from the oven. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing there, his expression unreadable. Thank you, I said quietly, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. Anytime. That evening, the tension between us reached its peak. We were sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. The conversation had started light, small talk about the weather, his plans for the week, but it didn't stay that way for long. You've been distant today, he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. I'm not distant, I replied, though the words felt hollow even to me. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. You're a terrible liar, Marianne. I sighed, setting my glass on the coffee table. It's just a lot to process, I admitted. I know, he said softly, his voice laced with understanding. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he met my gaze. You don't have to have all the answers, he said, but you have to stop running from this. This? I asked, my voice trembling. Us, he said simply. The word hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. There's no us, I said quickly, shaking my head. There could be, he replied, his voice steady. I looked away, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. It's not that simple, I whispered. It doesn't have to be, he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against mine. It just has to be real. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made my resolve falter, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Evan, It's okay, he said softly, his hand closing gently around mine. We'll figure it out together. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my mind. We'll figure it out together. For the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. It was late that night when it finally happened, the moment I'd been running from for weeks. The storm that had passed earlier seemed to have left something charged in the air, and though the house was quiet, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I was in the kitchen again, leaning against the counter with a glass of water, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The day had been heavy, too many words left unsaid, too many moments where the tension between us had felt too much to bear. And though I'd tried to ignore it, to push it down, it lingered, pressing against my chest with every passing hour. I didn't hear him at first. He moved so quietly, his steps barely audible against the wooden floor. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway, his hair mussed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're still up?" he said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, setting the glass down on the counter. He stepped into the room, the faint scent of rain still clinging to him. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, and yet there was something about him, something unguarded, almost vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. "Me neither," he said, leaning against the counter opposite me. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick and unspoken. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting, and though I told myself to look away, I couldn't. "What's keeping you up?" he asked finally, his voice low. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Just a lot on my mind," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Is it about me?" he asked, his tone gentle but direct. The question hit me like a wave, and I felt my breath catch. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to put into words the mess of emotions swirling inside me. "Evan, I began, but the words faltered. "It's okay," he said softly, stepping closer. "You don't have to say anything, He paused, his gaze searching mine, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I just need you to know that I care about you. More than I probably should, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't." His confession hung in the air, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This is complicated," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his tone steady, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." I shook my head, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "You're my stepson, Evan. This isn't supposed to happen." "I'm not your son," he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. "Not really. And even if I was, that wouldn't change how I feel about you." His words broke something in me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "You don't have to know," he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt myself leaning into it before I could stop myself. "I'm scared," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I know," he said softly, his hand sliding down to cup my face. "But you don't have to be, not with me." His words made my chest ache, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant and searching, but it quickly deepened, his arms wrapping around me as though he were afraid to let go. His hands slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him. The warmth of his touch chasing away the fear and doubt that had been weighing me down for so long. When we pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "If this isn't what you want, just say the word and I'll walk away." I looked at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. "I don't want you to stop," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His lips found mine again, more confident this time, and I felt his hands slide up to cradle my face, his touch both firm and reverent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an unraveling, a release of everything we'd been holding back. He guided me toward the couch, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into the warmth and security of his embrace. His hands moved with quiet reverence, exploring the curves of my body in a way that made me feel cherished, wanted, alive. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the intensity of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking through the haze. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of nerves and desire. His lips found mine again, and for the first time in years, I let myself surrender completely. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that made my chest ache. It was the way he whispered my name, soft and reverent, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. And when it was over, when we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of the candlelight casting soft shadows across our skin, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. "I think so," I said, my head resting against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm here for as long as you'll let me be." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "This is scary," I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to do it alone. As the storm outside began to fade, the thunder growing distant, I lay there in his arms, the sound of his heartbeat steady beneath my ear. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was enough. And for now, that was all I needed. It was late afternoon, and I was cleaning my bedroom when I heard the door creak behind me. I turned around, and there was Alden standing in the doorway, staring at the thing in my hands. My heart stopped. How could I explain this? The object was far from innocent. A large, brightly colored, toy. One that no polite conversation could sidestep. I had pulled it out of the drawer to dust the back of the cabinet, not thinking much of it. I had locked the door, or so I thought. Alden was my 23-year-old stepson. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. He worked at a local brewery and usually stayed out late with friends after his shifts. But there he was, tall and lean, his dark hair falling into his amused blue eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his voice caught somewhere between curious and teasing. My face went red hot. I dropped the item like it had burned me and grabbed the first thing I could find, a throw pillow from the bed, to cover it. "It's none of your business," I stammered, feeling my throat tighten. But his expression didn't change. If anything, he leaned against the doorframe, his curiosity growing. "You know, you don't have to act so embarrassed," he said with a small smirk. "It's not like I haven't seen something like that before." I wanted to crawl into a hole. The audacity of this kid. Well, man, really. To stand there so casually, completely unfazed, while my world spun out of control. I forced a laugh, desperate to diffuse the tension. "Alden, seriously, go mind your own business. You shouldn't even be in here." But he didn't move. For a moment, there was silence between us, heavy and almost unbearable. He wasn't looking at the pillow in my hands anymore. He was looking at me. His gaze was different, not the usual laid-back or playful glances I was used to. This one lingered too long, too intently. It was as if he'd peeled back a layer of the person he thought I was, and found someone else entirely. I felt something strange, a flicker of warmth deep in my chest, followed by a sharp pang of guilt. This was wrong. Whatever this was, it was absolutely wrong. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. I was married to his father. I shook my head and broke the silence. "Please, Alden, just go." He finally shrugged, lifting his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, his tone light again. But before he left, he gave me one last look. A look that sent my already unsettled thoughts into overdrive. As the door closed behind him, I sat down on the edge of the bed, the pillow still clutched against my chest. My heart was racing. I couldn't even bring myself to put the item back into the drawer. It felt like something invisible had shifted in the air between us. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I'd never see Alden the same way again. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the moment from my mind. I tried. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, and even sat next to Victor on the couch while he flipped through old westerns on the TV. But Alden's face, that amused smirk, and the unsettling glint in his eyes haunted me. Victor barely noticed my distraction. That was nothing new. He'd been wrapped up in his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles, for years now, ever since his retirement. I didn't resent him for it. That would have been too easy. But sometimes I felt like more of a live-in caretaker than a wife. At one point, I glanced down the hall and caught Alden's shadow as he moved around in his room. I could hear the faint hum of music coming through his door, a low bass line that didn't match the quiet stillness of the rest of the house. My heart jumped for no reason I could justify, and I turned my attention back to my husband. Victor was snoring softly, his chin tilted down toward his chest. He'd fallen asleep in his recliner again, the TV still droning on. I thought about waking him, but what would be the point? Instead, I stood and wandered into the kitchen, grateful for a moment of solitude. But I wasn't alone for long. Alden walked in, his bare feet quiet against the hardwood floor. He wore a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled like he'd just run his hands through it. "Hey," he said casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. "You're up late." "I could say the same about you," I replied, keeping my tone light. He smiled, leaning against the counter. "Just unwinding. You know, it's not easy being under this roof sometimes. The comment made me pause. What do you mean? He shrugged, but there was a hint of something serious in his expression. It's nothing. Just living here again, I guess. I feel like I don't fit anymore. I softened at that. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of maternal concern. It's just temporary, Alden. You'll figure things out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet. Thanks, Melina, he said, his voice quieter now. I appreciate that. For a moment we stood in silence. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the space between us shrinking even though neither of us moved. His eyes lingered on mine, and I felt that same flicker of warmth in my chest again. I cleared my throat and busied myself wiping the counter, desperate to break whatever spell was threatening to take hold. But Alden wasn't finished. About earlier, he started, his tone turning playful again. You don't have to be embarrassed, you know. I mean, we're all human, right? My hand froze mid-wipe, and I turned to him, trying to keep my composure. Alden, let's not talk about that, all right? It was an accident, and it's not worth bringing up again. Okay, he said, raising his hands in surrender, but there was a teasing edge in his smile that made my stomach flip. He walked past me then, close enough that I caught a faint whiff of his cologne. I didn't turn around, but I could feel his presence behind me for a moment before he finally left the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed next to Victor, my mind raced. What was happening to me? To us? To this house? I'd always been able to maintain clear boundaries, lines that weren't meant to be crossed. But Alden had a way of bending those lines, even when he wasn't trying to. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I prepared breakfast like I always did. Eggs, toast, and coffee for Victor, a smoothie for myself. Alden was the last to come into the kitchen, as usual, his hair still damp from a shower. He greeted Victor with a casual morning, and me with a warm smile that made my pulse quicken. The three of us sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and occasional snippets of conversation filling the air. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension. Every time Alden's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or refilled coffee, it felt deliberate. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and unreadable. Victor, of course, noticed none of this. After breakfast, Alden offered to help me clean up. Normally, he would have disappeared into his room or out with friends, so his offer caught me off guard. You don't have to, I said, stacking plates in the sink. I want to, he replied, already grabbing a dish rag. We worked in silence for a while, but the air between us felt charged. At one point, I reached for a glass at the same time he did, and our hands collided. Neither of us pulled away immediately. You're different, he said quietly, his voice just above a whisper. What do you mean? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I don't know. You don't act like other women your age. I laughed nervously, stepping back to create some distance. Well, that's flattering, I suppose. It's not just that, he continued, his tone serious now. You're real. You actually listen. You see people. The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the dishes. But as I scrubbed, I felt his presence close behind me. My heart was racing again, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could gather my thoughts, Victor's voice called from the living room. Melina? Where's my crossword book? The moment shattered, and Alden stepped back, giving me a small, knowing smile. I'll let you get back to him, he said, his voice light again. As he walked away, I felt a mix of relief and longing. I knew I was playing with fire, but some part of me couldn't help but reach for the heat. That afternoon, I busied myself with errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But when I returned home, I found Alden sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. He looked lost in thought, a far cry from the confident young man I was used to seeing. Hey, I said softly as I approached. He looked up, his face breaking into a small smile. Hey. Everything all right? He hesitated before answering. Yeah, just thinking. About what? About life, I guess. Where I'm headed. Where I should be headed. I sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. You're young, Alden. You don't have to have it all figured out yet. Maybe, he said, his gaze still fixed on the yard. Then, after a pause, he added, You ever feel like you're meant for something different? Like you're trapped in the wrong story? His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but the truth was, I didn't believe that myself. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. "You're not trapped," I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a moment he covered my hand with his, and the gesture felt impossibly intimate. I pulled away quickly, but the damage was done. Another line crossed, another boundary blurred, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it anymore. That evening, the sky turned dark with an oncoming storm. The air hung heavy, as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Victor had gone to bed early, as he often did, complaining about an aching shoulder. I had settled into the living room, a book in hand, but I couldn't focus. The storm outside mirrored the one building within me, something restless, unpredictable, and dangerous. Alden was in the kitchen, the sound of the fridge opening and closing, carrying through the quiet house. I could hear the faint clink of glass as he poured himself a drink. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway of the living room, holding 2 glasses. "Whiskey?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. "I don't usually drink this late." "Well, maybe tonight's an exception," he said with a grin, handing me a glass without waiting for an answer. I hesitated, but took it. The cool glass pressing against my palm. Alden sank into the armchair across from me, stretching his legs out casually. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble on his chin. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting," he smirked. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, taking a sip of the whiskey. It burned, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building all day. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, the storm outside growing louder. But then he spoke again, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at him warily. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it as though he were gathering his thoughts. "Do you ever feel stuck?" His question startled me. It was eerily similar to the one he'd asked earlier on the porch, but now there was a different weight to it. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Alden, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not? It's true." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I stood abruptly, needing to put space between us. "I think it's time we called it a night," I said, avoiding his gaze. But before I could leave the room, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I froze mid-step. "Oh," I muttered, my voice shaky. "It's just the storm," Alden said, his tone calm. I heard him stand, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. "Hold on, I'll find a flashlight." I heard him move closer, the faint rustle of fabric as he passed me. Then his hand brushed against mine in the dark, and I sucked in a sharp breath. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't pull away. His hand lingered, warm against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "Melina," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I turned toward him, even though I couldn't see him in the dark. But I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, his steady breathing. And then his hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, but he didn't let go. The first crack of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment, I saw his face, earnest, vulnerable, and impossibly close. And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping his shirt as though he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. When the lights flickered back on, we broke apart, both of us breathing hard. The reality of what we'd just done hit me like a wave, and I stepped back, my hands trembling. "This can't happen," I said, shaking my head. Alden didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said again, his voice steady, but the damage was done. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Alden as much as I could, throwing myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feel of his lips on mine, or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, Alden appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting the laundry down and finally meeting his gaze. "Alden, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't understand. If Victor ever found out—" "He won't," Alden interrupted. "And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." His words stung, partly because they were true, but that didn't make them right. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising. "It's about us, about the fact that whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible." Alden took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Why? Because you're afraid of what people might think? Because you're afraid of what you might think?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Melina," he continued, his voice softer now, "I'm not trying to make this harder for you. But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, and I don't think you can either." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then explain it to me," he said, his tone pleading. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of Victor's breathing beside me. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, none of which I could untangle. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would help calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Alden's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the doorframe as though he'd been waiting for me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and charged. And then, without thinking, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was, this impossible, dangerous thing between us, it wasn't going away. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there wasn't a storm to blame, nor a flickering light to hide behind. This time, it was deliberate. It started in the laundry room of all places. I was pulling warm towels from the dryer, the mundane rhythm of folding them, offering some kind of escape. The house was quiet. Victor had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "You're always working," Alden said, his voice light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough, but don't you ever get tired of it?" "Tired of what?" "Taking care of everything, taking care of everyone. When's the last time someone took care of you?" His words cut through me like a knife. I turned then, clutching a folded towel against my chest like a shield. "Alden, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having." "Why not?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked so at ease, so unbothered, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, searching, and impossibly focused on me. "Because," I said, my voice faltering. "It's not appropriate." "Appropriate," he repeated as though testing the word. "That's not the same as honest, though, is it?" I wanted to argue, to shut him down before he could say anything else that would make this worse. But before I could, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "You don't have to pretend with me, Melina," he said softly. "I see you. I see the way you carry this house, the way you keep everything together while everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself?" My throat tightened, and I shook my head, stepping back until I felt the edge of the counter against my hips. "Alden, whatever this is, it has to stop." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't lie to him, or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. But this time, I didn't stop him. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We were careful, or at least we thought we were. Alden was good at finding excuses to linger in the same room as me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cabinet door, even volunteering to run errands with me. At first, it was thrilling, the rush of something forbidden. But the reality of our situation weighed heavily on me. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Alden came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I stiffened, glancing toward the doorway to make sure no one was there. "Alden," I hissed, trying to pull away. "Victor could walk in any minute." "He's at the hardware store," Alden said, his voice calm. "Relax." But I couldn't relax, not anymore. The paranoia was starting to eat away at me. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Bethany, our nosy neighbor, waved at me from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me. "We need to talk," I said, turning to face Alden. "About what?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "About this. About us." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "What about us?" "This has to stop," I said, forcing the words out. "It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor." "Fair to Victor?" he repeated, his voice rising. "What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want." "What I want doesn't matter," I snapped. "It's not about me." "That's bullshit," Alden shot back. "You deserve to be happy, Melina. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Victor had invited Bethany and her husband over for dinner, and I was doing my best to play the role of the perfect hostess. But Bethany's sharp eyes seemed to be on me all night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. After dinner, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Bethany cornered me. "You've been awfully distracted lately," she said, her tone casual but her eyes probing. "Just busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Does Victor know?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Know what?" She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Whatever's going on with you and Alden." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. Bethany smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, Melina. Secrets have a way of coming out." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying Bethany's words in my mind. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, Alden found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer. "From this blowing up in our faces," I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Bethany knows, Alden. She knows." He frowned, his expression darkening. "How could she know?" "I don't know, but she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Victor?" "She won't," he said firmly. "You don't know that," I snapped. "You don't understand how dangerous this is." Alden grabbed my hand, his grip strong but not painful. "What I understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "You won't," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But we have to be careful. For both our sakes." The days that followed were tense. Bethany didn't say anything to Victor, at least not that I knew of. But the weight of her suspicion hung over me like a cloud. Alden tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then, one evening, Victor came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Alden, the two of us standing closer than we should have been. When we heard the front door open, we sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Victor called my name, his voice carrying through the house. "In here," I replied, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. Victor appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the room. For a moment I thought he was going to say something, but then he just nodded. "Dinner ready?" Almost, I said quickly. He left without another word, but the look he gave me lingered long after he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in the laundry room, the way Victor's eyes had lingered on me just a second too long. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Whatever this was between Alden and me, it felt too big, too consuming, to simply walk away from. But deep down I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. It started with Victor coming home unexpectedly early, but this time, it wasn't just the timing that caught me off guard. His face was tight, his expression unreadable, as he stepped into the house and set his briefcase down with a deliberate thud. "Alden," Victor called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Alden appeared in the hallway moments later, his casual demeanor contrasting Victor's obvious tension. "What's up?" he asked, leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets. Victor's eyes narrowed. "We need to talk. Now." The tone in his voice left no room for argument. Alden glanced at me briefly, concern flickering in his eyes, before following Victor into the living room. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart pounding. I couldn't hear their words at first, just the low rumble of Victor's voice and the occasional quieter responses from Alden. But as their conversation escalated, the words became clearer. "I know what's been going on," Victor said, his voice like ice. "What are you talking about?" Alden replied, his tone calm but guarded. "Don't play dumb with me," Victor snapped. "I've seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. Do you think I'm blind?" My blood ran cold. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to confront Alden. "Victor, you're imagining things," Alden said, his voice steadier than I thought possible. "There's nothing going on." "Don't lie to me," Victor roared, and the sound of something, a glass maybe, shattering followed. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I stepped into the doorway, my hands trembling. "Victor, stop." Both men turned to me, their expressions polar opposites. Victor's was a mix of anger and betrayal, while Alden's held something closer to defiance. "Melina," Victor said, his voice quieter now but no less dangerous. "Tell me the truth. Is there something going on between you two?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My silence was answer enough. Victor laughed bitterly, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I knew it," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. "Victor, please," I began, stepping closer. "Don't," he snapped, holding up a hand. "Don't try to explain it. There's nothing you can say that will make this okay." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Victor turned to Alden, his eyes blazing. "You're out," he said coldly. "Pack your things and leave, tonight." Alden stood his ground, his jaw tightening. "I'm not going anywhere." "Yes, you are," Victor shot back. "You're not going to stay under my roof and disrespect me like this." "I think you should calm down," Alden said, his tone low but firm. That only made Victor angrier. He stepped closer to Alden, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't tell me to calm down, you little—" "Stop it," I shouted, stepping between them. "Both of you, just stop." Victor turned to me, his eyes filled with hurt. "How could you, Melina?" he asked, his voice breaking. "After everything I've done for you?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," he said bitterly. "And now I have to deal with the fact that my own wife and my son—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I can't even say it." Alden reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't handle his touch. Not now, not with Victor watching. "I think it's best if I leave," I said quietly. Victor stared at me, his face hardening. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "This is my house. If anyone's leaving, it's him." "Victor," I began, but he cut me off. "No, I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You've made your choice, Melina, and now you're going to live with the consequences." Alden left that night. He packed a bag without a word, his movements tense and mechanical. I followed him to the driveway, my heart breaking with every step. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. He turned to me, his expression softer than I expected. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady. "You know that, right?" I nodded, but I didn't say anything. Because as much as I wanted to believe him, I wasn't sure if it was true. As his car disappeared down the street, I felt an ache deep in my chest, a mix of guilt, loss, and something I couldn't quite name. The days that followed were unbearable. Victor barely spoke to me, his silence more punishing than any words could have been. I threw myself into household tasks, desperate to keep busy, but nothing could distract me from the emptiness I felt. And then, a week later, the letter arrived. It was from Alden. No return address, just my name written in his familiar handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding as I unfolded the paper. Melina, I know things are complicated right now, but I need you to know that I meant what I said. This isn't over. I don't care what anyone else thinks or says. I can't just walk away from you. I won't. When you're ready, I'll be waiting. Always, eh? I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to burn it and pretend it never existed. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to admit to, clung to his words like a lifeline. That night, I tucked the letter into the back of my dresser drawer, hiding it away like a secret I wasn't ready to share with the world. Because deep down, I knew Alden was right. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.